Hi, my name is Josh Taylor, and I'm a research and training associate with the VCU Rehabilitation Research and Training Center. And I'm going to talk for a little bit about the Americans with Disabilities Act and how it's used to support inclusion for employees. This is part one of a two-part series for the RRTC on employer practices for individuals with disabilities. So what we'll talk about in this short webcast is defining how the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, protects employees with disabilities, identifying which employers the law affects and which it doesn't, and explaining what the ADA requires and doesn't of employers, as well as just talking about a general overview of what the ADA is. So let's start by talking about what the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, is. We recently celebrated the 30-year anniversary of the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which passed in 1990 and went into effect shortly thereafter in 1992. And it's a really broad piece of legislation that that sets out to prevent any discrimination based on disability. And in the scope of how it defines this, it's really quite broadly. And we'll talk a little bit about some of how that affects employers, but really it goes much further beyond to really talk about sort of protecting the civil rights of individuals with disabilities against really many, many types of discrimination that can occur within communities. So first, I think before we get into talking specifically about how this affects employers, I think it's important to think about how the Americans with Disabilities Act really reframed in legislation the thinking about how disability was treated. And we sometimes talk about this as a medical model or a social model of disability. And what we mean when we talk about these different models is really different ways of thinking about what is a disability. And so, you know, a medical model is sort of the traditional or the old school or the previous model of thinking about disability, which is that the impairment or the disability really rests in the individual, that the individual is sort of lacking the ability to do something that we would expect quote unquote normal people to do, or typical individuals to be able to do. And so the way that we sort of address those disabilities or those impairments within this medical model is to provide intervention, to provide supports that target those deficits. And it really is thinking about the ways in which individuals are, have these deficits compared to what we expect sort of this quote unquote normal functioning within a certain context. And really, the Americans with Disabilities Act represents a shift that we've seen in the research literature up until that point, and the thinking and the advocacy about disability that really looks at this idea of a social model of disability. And so this really turns this idea of this deficit or medical model of disability on its head and says, no, the disability does not rest with an individual. The disability is the misalignment between the way that our society is structured in a series of ways. And so, as you can see in this visual, you can see a person in a wheelchair confronting a set of stairs. And so the medical model would say that the impairment is the problem, but the social model shifts that to say, you know, the stairs are the problem. If we can build a ramp, everyone can use a ramp. That's more universally designed, we sometimes say. And so the disability is about the way that various things are constructed within an organization, a building. So as we talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act, this is the kind of mindset that I think is most useful to really think about how the Americans with Disabilities Act reframes how we include individuals with disabilities within organizations, within communities, and everything like that. So I think that's a helpful way to start. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about what the ADA actually does. So we know it prevents discrimination broadly. So in terms of what we'll talk about in our short time today, really the key feature of the legislation is that it prevents employers from discriminating in all aspects of employment. And we'll talk a little bit about this, but when we talk about all aspects of employment, this covers from even before individuals are hired, when they're sort of accessing hiring materials, going through interview process and being considered for a job, all the way through to their time with an organization and an employer, to the time that they exit and leave an employer. So it sets out certain specific requirements that we'll talk a little bit, and then we'll get a little bit more into part two, where we'll talk about some of those reasonable accommodations and what they are, how we can think through making sure that they're effective, everything like that. The third main point is that it prevents retaliation. So an individual has protection within the ADA guidance from retaliation because of sort of advocating for rights against discrimination within that. And then the last part is that, it requires that medical records be kept confidential and separate from personnel files. So anything related to a person's disability is not a core part of their personnel file and should be kept separate and confidential in order to respect their privacy and protect them from discrimination. So we'll talk a little bit first about who is protected by the ADA. And so we know it's individuals with disabilities, but the ADA really sets out some very specific parameters about who qualifies under that. And so those who meet these essential requirements, these general requirements about having a disability, and then those that can perform essential functions of a job. So when we're talking about how the ADA affects employers, it's both those that have a disability, but those that are able to perform those essential functions of a job. And so we'll get into that a little bit, but essentially those essential functions are tasks that are absolutely necessary for the job. And so, an individual might require certain accommodations or certain supports to be able to perform those. But as long as they can perform those essential job functions or job requirements, then they're protected under the ADA. So again, thinking back to this protects individuals even as they're being considered and going through the interviewing and hiring process, but they have to qualify for these essential functions in order to be protected. But then we also need to think about, what is a disability? And so, the ADA defines this very broadly. And it's really any physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. And so you can see these cover, sensory impairments, movement. They could affect performance of various tasks and learning, aspects of thinking and cognition, reading, any of these areas that are impacted by a person's disability qualify them to be protected under the ADA against that discrimination. And so some examples of disabilities that are protected under the ADA. First, I think it's important to note that when we think about disability, we also think about sort of a chronic condition or long-term disability or something that's part of a person's that they're dealing with for a long period of time, but these can also be a short-term disability that are impacted by a specific condition that may only be in effect for a certain period of time. But it can also affect, as we said, those sensory impairments. So, visual impairments, hearing impairments, mobility. It could be individuals with developmental disabilities like autism and intellectual disabilities, emotional and mental illnesses that are either short or long-term in nature. Health conditions that may affect some of those aspects of work, learning disabilities that may impact certain job functions, a traumatic brain injury, another one that can be either a short or long-term in terms of its nature. Epilepsy, hypertension, asthma, diabetes, you get a sense of this, just the scope. And these are only a few of the examples of types of disabilities or examples of disabilities that could impact individuals. But you also see on that list cancer that's in remission or prior heart attacks that may have an impact on an individual in their maybe need for accommodations at the work. So just a few examples. And so again, for these qualified individuals, the ADA prohibits discrimination for the entire duration of their tenure, but even previous to that, at the time of their application to a company. And this protects against any harassment, obviously, but also requires that any medical information related to their disability is kept confidential. So that's a really important part. And then that last part is one that we'll explore in more depth in part 2 of this webcast, which is that there's reasonable accommodations that need to be provided. And those are ones that, can cover, many different aspects, but we'll get more into depth about that as far as some key takeaways. So check out part 2, as I said, we'll get more in depth with accommodations. We'll look at some facts and myths about accommodations, including the fact that that most individuals require accommodations that are free or extremely inexpensive, and often boost not only the individual's productivity, but others at the workplace. So a really a little bit deeper dive into specific accommodations in part 2. But just in wrapping up part 1 of this series, before we get on to part 2, the big picture that we want to convey about the ADA and its requirements is that it not only protects individuals from discrimination, but it really sets out an encouraging access and inclusion rather than compliance. And so thinking back to what we talked about at the beginning, as far as that shift from a medical model to a social model, really the goal of the Americans with Disabilities Act is about reducing those barriers to make sure that all individuals are included within a workplace. And so it really encourages organizations and entities to problem solve, to figure out what are those barriers that can be addressed to create a more inclusive environment, rather than thinking about this in terms of compliance. And this can really be a useful framework for increasing not only the inclusion of individuals with disabilities, but also their productivity within a workplace as well, making sure that the right supports are in place, the right accommodations that we'll explore in part 2, to really make sure that they're sort of maximizing their productivity and contribution and value as employees. So thank you for listening to part 1 of our 2-part webcast on the Americans with Disabilities Act. As I said, I hope you'll check out part 2, where we'll get more into depth about accommodations, and check out more of our resources on the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Employer Practices for Individuals with Disabilities at ep.vcurrtc.org. Thank you very much.